Hi, I'm Victoria Baker, and I will be discussing muted group theory. Muted group theory was first brought about by an anthropologist, Edwin Arner, when he recognized the lack of women's voices and experiences being recorded by ethnographic methods. Men were the ones who were recorded, and they gave their account of the women. Women's voices and experiences were not heard from the standpoint of women themselves. This idea was further explored by Charis Kramare, former dean of the International Women's University of Germany. She began her study on language and women by looking into cartoons. She found that of the 54 cartoons she sampled, less than a fifth contained women speaking. With that being said, this led Kramare to looking into the idea of power. Basically, she found that with men holding most of the positions of power in the public and private arenas, this allowed language to follow suit and therefore constitutes that the likelihood of having one's voice muted is linked rather directly to whether one belongs to a subordinate group such as women. If you do find yourself in a subordinate group, you are forced to sift your communication through that of a man. First, women must cognitively identify their experience and then seek to translate it through a man's perspective. Charis Kramare sought to illustrate the idea of men holding power in language by telling a story a woman mentioned at one of her conferences. Basically, a man and woman were in a marital relationship, both working full-time jobs and both leaving and arriving back home at the same time. After the long day, the woman was expected to cook dinner for both her and her husband. When asking for her husband to help with the meal making, he replies, "I would, but you do it so much better than I do." The woman was at first flattered by her husband's compliment on her abilities, but later figured out that this was a verbal strategy used by her husband in order to get out of making the meal. However, once she realized this, she had a difficult time in expressing her point of view, being that there was no word in the English language to describe the strategy of men. All in all, this illustrates the idea that men are the creators of language, and they created it to serve their own experiences. Kramare seeks to, number one, call attention to the muting of the voices of women, and number two, reform language so that women's experiences are represented from the standpoint of actual women. In my research of muted group theory, I also looked into others' illustrations and studies on the subject. One was a study conducted by Judy C. Pearson at a Midwestern private college. She conducted an exercise that involved men and women creating gender-specific words. The exercise was called Ginlets. Pearson took 5 males and 9 females and split them into gender-specific groups. They were given 1 hour to generate as many words as they could to describe gender-specific experiences. At the end of the study, it was found that there were no words that crossed both genders. Both the men and women created completely different words. And it was also found that women also only generated words that dealt with relationships or their personal appearances. And of those 13 words they created, 8 had to do with men. On the other hand, men created words exclusively discussing competition, personal agency, and power. And only 1 word created by the male group discussed women. This goes to recognize that women do not have words to accurately describe men and their experiences, but most words used for women are already accredited in our everyday life and language. This same idea was represented by a study on women's menstruation and the lack of language to describe this idea for women. This study was conducted by talking to women of East India and asking them about how they specifically communicate menstruation. It was found that most of the words used were lacking in empowerment and were generally centralized around the man's point of view of menstruation. The purpose of this study was to point out the words being used in East India almost always focused on the woman's emotional state or physical location, never on the physical state of the woman's body. The purpose was also to further the possibility of creating words that represented empowerment for the woman rather than an oppressive state. Finally, after looking over the research of others, it came to my attention the lack of power in the woman's voice in the Western Christian Church. If I were to conduct a research project, I would look into what role women currently play in the church and what people think the role women play should be. I would also have women pastors deliver 2 messages, one giving men's experiences as examples and one giving the woman pastors' experiences as examples to see whether or not the men of the congregation would be able to regurgitate and process the woman's experience. All in all, whether in church, in politics, or at home, there lies the central theme that women are not being heard and their experiences are not being accounted for. The goal of Munich group theory is simply for this language barrier of women to be acknowledged and to progress into having language serve women as well. Thank you.